Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today's a Q&A episode, and I have 3 questions I want to dive into. But first, before I go into that, I just want to go over a few ways you can help support the podcast. So first, if you'd found this podcast be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find this. It will help more people get this information. If you found this to be helpful and you feel like somebody else would benefit from this, please leave a rating and review. Again, always trying to grow the show, want to get this information out to more people. And the best way to do that is to get those rating and reviews. But again, appreciate everybody who listens to this show. Next, I have my free masterclass on body recomp, what it is, how to do it. Basically, once you are done with that, you'll know everything there is to know about body recomp. So again, if you're interested in that, please click the link in the show notes. And then next, I also have my free masterclass on nutrition periodization. So again, what it is, how to do each phase, what phases there are, common mistakes, adjustments, how to set it up. Everything you would need to know about each nutrition phase is in there. So again, if you're trying to figure out how to run a fat loss phase, which is one of the things I'm going to go over today, again, that would be for you. And the link to that is in the show notes. Next, if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_, and that's where I'm most active on social media. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's question. The first one isn't really a question, but more so just a comment. And then I'm going to go into some things here with this. So ever since my husband, age 54, started shift work, he's put on weight around his stomach. And I think this is very common, right? Now, a couple things. People will automatically assume that because you're doing shift work, you're automatically that's going to lead to fat gain. Or again, in this situation, I think this just goes to show the importance of a healthy circadian rhythm and just a natural kind of sleep and weight cycle and the importance of sleep. But I think in this situation, people think that, oh, it's automatically going to lead to fat gain. But I think this shows that when we have these kind of big changes in our lifestyle, one, our body's probably not going to run as efficiently as it could. And then two, some of these things just creep up on you if you're not careful, right? So I'm going to dive into the circadian rhythm, how to manage it if you do work shift work, and just understand some of the potential issues that you're going to run into by working shift work. And then I'll wrap up with a client who was doing shift work, then not, and then now is again, and then where she is at and how she wants to change things up. So first, let's talk about it. So shift work is typically where somebody will work overnight several days during the week, and then they'll have one or several days off, and then they go back to being awake during the day. So they work overnight, and then they have a couple of days where they're back to normal there with that. There's not any evidence that night shift workers consume more calories than the average day shift worker, but however, night shift work is associated with increased risk of GI issues, metabolic issues, cardiovascular disease, as well as depression and cancer, right? And really, this just comes down to how we know the importance of circadian rhythm with all these things and how it can really impact your overall health. Like I said, this isn't like you're for sure going to, from a body comp standpoint, you aren't going to just automatically gain body fat. However, this is going to be something that's going to put you at a higher risk of it, right? It's a lot like stress, where stress itself isn't going to lead to higher levels of body fat, but it's going to make it more likely there with that. Also, too, one thing I want to say on this is I think this is something that as you age, it starts to impact you more. So if you're somebody who does shift work when you're younger, you may be able to get away with things more. But as we get further into it, not only this night shift work going to impact your body comp and your overall health, but age, it's just going to continue to get worse. But again, from a body comp perspective, you can definitely work around it. But just for overall health, I would definitely say that shift work is something that just in general, even when you're younger, but especially as you age, is just going to impact your overall health. There's not a ton of research on night shift workers, right? It's still very young kind of. There's just not a ton of research on it. However, there's some things that we can take from general circadian rhythm, sleep hygiene, and whatnot that we can utilize with this avatar, right? So again, if you're somebody who works night shift, understand that, look, you aren't automatically going to gain body fat. There's something, but you are going to be at a higher risk. And just from an overall health perspective, your overall health is likely to be compromised, at least somewhat, right? So again, this is a sign that if you have to do it for now, you should, but as you get older, you should definitely look at switching off of it, even if really at the end of the day, yeah, I'm sure that you can make more money doing shift work. However, we need to look at, is that worth your health in the long run? And again, it's ultimately up to you there, what is going to fit you best, and you need to decide that with that. So again, with that kind of preface out of the way, knowing that, hey, you are at a higher risk of gaining body fat and your health is likely going to be compromised in the long run. And again, this is going to impact you more as you age. Now we can go into this. And again, I would say some other things we need to look at from shift work perspective too is, okay, so when we don't get great sleep, we know the importance of staying consistent with our sleep times. We know that can impact our sleep. And then when we get poor sleep, that's going to increase hunger, increase cravings for tasty foods, right? You're also not going to get as great quality sleep, so you're not going to have as much energy. So that's going to impact your motivation. That's going to impact your decision making. And then on top of it, we have the fact that this probably is not going to put your body in the most optimal position from a body comp perspective and health perspective. And you can see where you're just going to be at an increased risk of body fat because of those things, right? Again, we're going to have those higher hunger and cravings, which is going to make it easier to consume more calories overall. And then we're less likely to want to go and work out. We're less likely to make good choices. So you can see that kind of mismatch there. Again, when we get poor sleep, indirectly can things like testosterone, which can impact your total daily energy expenditure. But then also, like I said, you're not as motivated to move. So now you're expending less energy. So it's like now we're tipping our energy balance more likely into a positive energy balance or maintenance versus a deficit or staying at maintenance, whatever you want to do there with that. So you can see where these things start to add up. It's a combination of eating more food, the types of foods we're eating, less likely to want to move, less likely to make better choices. And we could see some physiological things happen that potentially cause us to expend less energy overall, right? So again, you can see where all this adds up. So let's talk about some things that you can do if you're a night shift worker, right? We know, like I've stated multiple times already, you're more likely to gain body fat. So we need to understand. I think if we understand what I just said there, now we can go in and we can make better and more informed choices around this, right? So let's talk about food choice and timing. So ideally, the shift worker would keep their meal timing as close to the same on off days as shift days to keep their consistent circadian cues. Let's say you work from 8 to 8. So you would have you'd have your normal meal around 7 to 7:30. And then during the shift, ideally you would fast. Okay. So if you're working overnights, you would fast. This isn't feasible for everybody. Okay. So again, you're not going to be able to do this. However, if we are going to eat overnight, ideally we would have something like once we would have a high protein, carbohydrate meal, and then a low to moderate type fat meal. And the carbohydrates, again, we want the low glycemic foods, right? So again, we're looking at, you wouldn't want like high sugar foods, right? Processed type foods. You'd want things like, if you're going to do that, again, fruit, veggie, things higher fiber and whatnot from a carbohydrate perspective there, right? Again, we really want to try to limit those things high in sugar and high in fat, right? It's not just sugar, it's the high fat, high sugar foods. And again, that's usually those highly processed foods. But again, in the middle of the night, people are bringing it and shift work, people may be bringing in food, and again, you're tired. What do you want? You want something like that there with that. Again, carbohydrate and fat metabolism is altered in the evening, but protein is not. So again, this is why we want to choose that higher protein, low GI carbohydrate, and low to moderate fat from a macro perspective, right? Ideally, if you can't fast, so again, if you can't fast, you do that. However, again, if fasting also isn't ideal from a timing perspective, you'd want to be careful to have food in that, again, the kind of the really like overnight time. So that would be like anywhere from 1 a.m. to 5 or 6 a.m. right there with that. Those would be the times that we would want to be careful with having meals. So again, if you're going to eat, try to get it in before 12 or 1 a.m. and then get it in maybe when you get home or something like that. And then you get off your shift, and then ideally you would eat a meal before you go to sleep, right? Right after you would get off from work and before you go to sleep, right? Again, that's going to kind of make sure that you're eating around that same time that you typically would there with that. From there, whenever you wake up, you would have a normal meal, right? That would be like your lunch meal that you would have on a normal day. And then you would have your dinner around 7 to whatever it may be, right? 6 to 8, somewhere around there with that. And then again, on days that you're not working, you would try to keep that same timing with that. So again, we would keep that same timing, but now we would just switch it up again on the days that we're not working. Ideally, if you set it up on the days that you are working, now you can match up those meal times. And again, you're keeping relatively the same meal timing there. And again, this is going to be great from a circadian health perspective and just a GI standpoint as well too there with that. So that's how we would do food timing there with that. Okay. So that's again, ideally we're not eating a ton overnight. If we are, it's going to be higher protein. Really try to avoid it in the middle of the night. Really try to avoid those high carbohydrate, high sugar, high fat meals, more processed type foods. And then again, try to stick to the same meal timings from your days on as your days off there with that. Again, maybe it's not exactly the same exact time, but try to keep it within an hour or two there with that. And again, that's going to be the best way to go there. Now, the days that you do work, and maybe you have a little bit of food overnight, just understand that you may need to eat a little bit less if you're going from 4 meals to 3 meals, you may have to eat a little bit less there with that. All right. So what about working out? And so again, with a client I had, she was a nurse, worked overnight. We made sure that we worked on these things. Okay. Really limit that meals overnight and then try to stick to that same consistent timing from her days that she's working, days that she's not working. There with that. Prior to working with me, there was no structure to it, eating kind of any time, eating these higher carbohydrate meal, higher fat, higher sugar meals, not really focused on protein. And now you can see where you don't have any structure to when you eat, you're eating at all times. Like your body's just going to be so confused. And now next thing you don't feel like you're eating a lot, but you're eating more calorie dense foods and therefore eating more calories overall. So you could see where this could lead to some body fat gain, and especially in the midsection, right? Because you're not getting good sleep, cortisol's probably all out of whack and whatnot. And again, you're going to see a little bit more of that fat gain around the midsection in particular there with that. So working out, this was another one that I worked on with my client here. So ideally we would want to work out prior to our shift. Okay. We would much rather you have that, because that's one, going to help you stay more alert and awake during your night shift. And ideally we wouldn't work out in the morning after the shift, because this is now going to, not only are you going to be tired, but then this is going to start to impact your sleep, right? And then it's just this vicious cycle. So ideally from a workout perspective, we're working out before our shift, and then afterwards we're going to sleep so we can maintain that timing that we had talked about there with that. Again, it's going to come down to, if you're working out after, it's like now your sleep's going to be impacted. So that's going to impact all those things that I talked about, but you're also going to work out after your shift. You're going to be tired. Now you're not really going to push yourself in your training because you're just super tired. And then you might not see the adaptations that you want. So it's like you're going to the gym, but now it's like it's almost having a negative impact here from that perspective. Non-shift workday, really working out when works best for you. You could do it in the morning. Really, what works best for you on these off days is fine. We're not overly concerned there about that. All right, so let's talk about sleep and how we can get good sleep, because again, we know that sleep's going to be impacted, but how can we best manage sleep during this time? So exposing yourself to bright blue light at the beginning or throughout your night shift can help with alertness and focus. So again, we want to make sure we get that light, and there with that, that's going to help keep us up, right? This would be the opposite of what you would tell somebody when they're trying to go to sleep. We want to avoid blue light exposure to wake up. This can be helpful there with that. You could put on blue light blocking glasses before leaving your workplace, and that's going to help avoid exposure to daylight. And then you would wear these until you go to sleep. So that's something that we could do there. Again, we'd want to make sure our room is blacked out, try to keep as much light out as possible, and keep it cool in order to get good sleep. So again, you wouldn't want, try to get blackout curtains, keep the room nice and cool. Again, these are things that we would tell people for normal sleep hygiene habits here with that. And then you would try to go to sleep as soon as possible after your night shift, right? You'd get that meal in, and then you would try to go to sleep as quickly as possible. There's that. You can use melatonin to help reset and to just help you fall asleep as well too. Again, when you're switching over, again, using melatonin can help reset your circadian rhythm and when you fall asleep. And then on days that you are also working, you could help in the morning as well too there with that. And also you could use naps strategically as well too. If you're losing a lot of sleep, you could use napping there with that. Again, getting regular uninterrupted sleep is going to be best, but in these situations, we could use some naps here with that. And you can also extend your sleep on days that you're not working as well too. Again, staying consistent and whatnot is going to be helpful. But if you really have a large sleep debt, you may want to extend that sleep time a little bit more on those days there with that. So that's how we would go about it. So again, I had this client where we worked on these things, and initially she saw great results, right? Because she went from all these things were adding up. She wasn't doing any of these things. And then she got injured and she went off of overnight. For her, it was like, oh, I work overnights. I feel great. This is how I should feel. And then she got off overnights and then started to realize how good she can feel on a normal sleep schedule. And then progress continued. And then she had to go back to shift work. And this is where she really started to notice the impact of shift work. And for her now, she for now needs to stay doing shift work, but in the future she is going to switch out of it, which for her initially was like, I'm never going to do this. I love working nights, but now she's seen how it can impact how she feels, and she's going to switch off of it. It really does make a big difference. So hopefully this kind of helps you figure out how to manage it. Again, it's going to make things more challenging, but it's not like it's a death sentence. You can certainly work around it. It is just going to make things more challenging. And if you ask this question, maybe have your husband listen to this, but also understand that like things are just going to be more challenging, and you are going to have to maybe pay attention to your habits and be more mindful of what you're doing when you're working shift work, especially if you switch off of it and then come back on to it there with that. All right, let's go on to the second question. So in general, how aggressively do you diet your athletes? I'm going to just consider my clients my athletes. I don't have any athletes in terms of like physique athletes or athletes, but really my rule of thumb here would not change whether it's an athlete or not, or just a regular client. But really, it ultimately just comes down to what they can adhere to. People will ask like, how fast should I fat loss diet? What's the right way to do it? And really, it just comes down to what can you stick to? And most people for extended periods of time cannot stick to anything more than say 0.75 to 1% of body weight per week. Okay. I just have found that anything over that, it's just hard to adhere to it. So again, this really, you'll hear this get brought up a ton of, and maybe sometimes I do this as well too. We don't want to lose too quickly because we don't want to lose muscle and stuff like that. The thing is, you really don't need to worry about people losing too much for too long anyways, because it's just too hard. There's too much of a drive to maintain weight or to gain weight, evolutionarily speaking, that it's just hard for people. And then you combine it with the modern environment that people just aren't going to be able to sustain these super aggressive fat loss diets for too long. What I'll say is most people, when working with a coach, I would say, and this is something we build to, I think most people have the skills, not everyone, but some people have the skills to go upwards of 0.75 to 1% of body weight per week. However, I think most people probably fall closer to 0.25 to 0.75% of body weight per week when it's all said and done. And again, this is like, people are like, well, that doesn't make, why I want to go quicker. Why would I do that? Again, it just comes down to the environment, that drive to consume calories when you are fat loss dieting, and the quicker you go. And again, just people's lifestyle, right? It just is really hard to lose any more than that over extended periods of time, right? A couple things I'll say on this is the longer you go and the leaner you are, the less you should try and lose per week. The longer you want to fat loss diet, or the longer you are trying to fat loss diet, understand that you're not going to be able to go super aggressive for extended periods of time. And the leaner you are as well too. And this simply comes down to, one, there's going to be that drive to eat. You're going to be super hungry. Energy levels are going to be low, and the maintenance of lean body mass, right? And the more aggressive we are in these things, the more likely these things are going to show up there with that. But again, most people can't adhere to anything more than this for multiple weeks on end. And this isn't a shot at anybody. This is just the way it is. Again, you could do it a 3 to 5 week cut at 1% of body weight per week, but ultimately that comes down to, again, I think having the skills to do it, making sure you have the right methods in place, having some guidance, and then having a good game plan afterwards is all going to be super important there with that. But like I said, I think most people fall between that 0.25 to 0.75% of body weight per week. And this is going to be best from an adherence standpoint, mitigating diet fatigue, maintenance of lean body mass, and all those things. So let's look at a number here. Let's say you're 170 pounds. You're looking at 0.4 to 1.3 pounds per week, right? Like I said, I think anything more than that, people can do that for a couple weeks, but anything more than that, it's just really hard to sustain. And again, this doesn't mean what you'll typically see happen here is somebody was eating a lot of food, they cut out a lot of their food, and then on that first week or two, they lose more than this. And they're like, oh, this is what I want to see every week. But a lot of that's water weight. And to actually lose that weight consistently over time is very challenging to do, right? And like I said, most people just cannot do it. So I would say those are the time frames, those are the rates of loss there with that, in terms of what that's going to look like. And in terms of how many calories that is, it's just really going to depend on the person. And this is why we look at their numbers, we look at their biofeedback, and we look at their results, and then we see, okay, how do we get to that kind of rate of loss that we're looking for there with that? Again, that could be a little bit more calories than you think. It could be less. It just really depends on the person. It also depends on their tracking skill, what they're tracking, and everything like that. So again, I think the moral of the story is, we talk about, oh, hey, you don't want to be overly aggressive with your fat loss dieting. But at the end of the day, most people aren't able to sustain super aggressive rates of fat loss for any amount of time longer than anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, right? It's just too challenging. They don't have the skills. The environment is not set up. Their lifestyle is not great. So again, these are all things that are going to impact that. But in a perfect world, I think anywhere from 0.75 to 1% of body weight per week is a good rate of loss. And you're really going to see good amounts of fat loss there with that. But there's also nothing wrong with slowing it down and making it a little bit longer, right? And you have more flexibility. It's going to be more sustainable for you. You're going to potentially build muscle in that process, depending on where your body comp is at. So there's a lot of pros and cons to each approach there with that. All right, so let's go on to the last question of the day, thoughts on mini cuts in general. So this kind of goes back to what I just talked about, right? I think first, so it's establishing what your definition of a mini cut is and what the use of it would be for. A mini cut, a lot of people think of a mini cut as it's just a shortcut, which it can be that. But also mini cuts were brought up to be something that you would throw in the middle of a building phase, where it's there to, you basically drop weight, you get really aggressive with your fat loss, right? For a short period of time. In the middle of a building phase, you're just trying to cut off some body fat. But the other thing you're trying to do is to increase your hunger, okay? Because again, what some people run into when they're building for extended periods of time is hunger starts to drop off, and then it's hard to get in the amount of calories that they need to get to. Again, now we're wiping out most of the people that would consider a mini cut when we use that definition. So what is your definition of a mini cut, right? I think that's the first thing that we need to establish here. Are you using it as just a shortcut, or are you using it as a way where it's a very aggressive fat loss approach for a short period of time in the middle of a building phase to help you gain more weight and to help increase hunger in a building phase, right? Like I said, that's going to wipe out most people there with that, but that's the definition that, again, I think RP Dr. Mike used from a mini cut there with that. So I think, again, we need to establish what your definition of a mini cut is. Okay. So now I'll dive into this. So in general, if you feel like you need to use one regularly, then I would look at the mental side of things or your methods. Okay. So if this is something where you feel like you need a mini cut all the time, either if you're using either definition of a mini cut, but you feel like you need to use one regularly, then you need to look at the mental side of things. If you feel like any amount of fat gain is you need to cut off body fat because you want to maintain like a really shredded look. Well, you need to look at the mental side of things. Like, why is that? Again, diving in deeper to that is super important. But your method, if you feel like you regularly need a mini cut to cut off some body fat, then I would say you are overdoing your building phase and you need to improve your methods of that building phase, right? So there's that. And it also depends on your ultimate goal in terms of, again, what are we doing this for? So I think that goes back to the first thing. So in general, though, my thoughts on this are mini cuts from like just a shortcut that you randomly do from time to time. Again, I think it's fine. Again, but if you feel like you need to use it too often, then I would look at your methods, right? Are we taking our fat loss phases seriously? You're 100% on. And then when you're not trying to drop body fat, then you're 100% off. We would need to look at that. Can we potentially improve that? And still the same thing applies. Like if you're doing the second mini cut option there, which is like to gain more weight, to increase hunger, again, I wouldn't overdo those. That's just there. I would do that maybe once or twice, but I'm less likely to use those. And I would say 99.9% of the time are not using those. That's something I've used in the past. I just really am not a huge fan of them at this point. I think you're better off being more adherent during your building phase, going super slow. And then if you're starting to feel some of these things of low hunger, you need to gain more weight, you've probably outdone your building phase at that point. So I'm less likely to use these now. I personally probably won't use one again for myself, nor will I use one for a client there with that. But in general, though, like I said, a mini cut, like I said on the second question, the faster we go with the weight loss, the shorter it needs to be. So we need to take that into consideration there with that. So that's my thoughts on mini cuts. Again, what's your definition of it? If you feel like you need to use one regularly, you need to look at your methods. And yeah, again, I think it just comes down to terminology. If you just have been building for a while and you feel like you need to just tighten things up for 4 to 6 weeks, that's perfect. Again, I would be careful with how aggressive you go eat with that. So again, it's really context dependent, but in general, I'm not a fan of using this kind of phrase mini cuts or like having these mini cuts built into a building phase where you like every 4 weeks you do a cut, right? I'm not a huge fan of those either, but you could potentially use them strategically as well. So hopefully that gives you some insights into my thoughts on mini cuts there with that. I think really establishing your definition of what it is super important there with that. And again, what is the goal of it? What are you trying to get out of it? And I think figuring that out is super important. Now, sorry, I don't have a ton to go in on this just because I think thoughts on mini cuts in general just probably isn't the greatest way to ask a question. But again, if anybody has specific questions on mini cuts, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But those are my kind of general thoughts on mini cuts. So that's it for this episode. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Again, if you have any questions on what phase you should be in, what your calories should be, what your macros should be, should you do a fat loss phase, should you do a building phase, then that's what my free 30-minute strategy call is for. Again, we dive into your goals and where you want to be and how we can bridge that gap and map out a game plan for you in the future. So if you're interested in that, the link to that is in the show notes. That's it for this episode, and I will chat with you next time.